All right, guys, you have reached Rebel's strange and unexplained phenomena of the South Mountains of North Carolina. And this is the conclusion of the cliffhanger that I laid on y'all last night, part 2 of episode 17. So before we get into part 2, let's quickly recap part 1. Connie, a lady that I met a few months ago who was in her 70s, offered to share with me a series of ghostly encounters that her family experienced, her mom, her dad, her, and her little sister, between the late 40s into the 1960s. And when Connie was born, her mother went into a horrible battle with postpartum depression. And the father later in life would talk about what a dark cloud hung over the family, the home, even the property at the time. Connie's mother began to have these terrible dreams, a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking through the backyard, going to the well to get water, and an old hag, an old lady who was stooped over, very scary looking, would come out of the well and come toward her with her hands outstretched, her bony, gnarled fingers reaching toward her. And the last thing in each nightmare that the hag would do, she would say, "I must have rest, or you and yours never will." Later, after Connie was in grammar school, she had a horrifying experience one night, but it was not a dream. Out of the fireplace on a cold winter night with fire in the fireplace, this old hag, this very scary looking entity, came out of the fireplace and terrified Connie to the point that she couldn't scream. She had sat up in bed and she couldn't scream. She couldn't say a word. And the old hag said the same thing to her. The family befriended another family, and the wife from the other family and Connie's mother would come to be very good friends. And one day, Connie's mother finally opened up to her best friend and told her everything from A to Z about this situation. They had spoke of it to no one else. And immediately after the conversation, Connie's friend said, "Do you remember when I spoke of root doctors?" You see, earlier in episode 1, there was a comment made about, too bad that we don't have the old root doctors around here anymore for medicinal reasons. But Connie's friend said, "Yeah, you remember when I spoke of root doctors?" Said, "There's a story that's handed that one lived on the backside of your property. And this story's been handed down for many, many years. But that this old lady, a root doctor, lived in an old cabin on the backside of the property. And that she was allowed to live there by the property owner at the time simply because she offered a valuable service. And that was her knowledge of plants and how to use those plants for treating disease and illness. She was not highly esteemed in the community, and generally speaking, in the case of the old root doctors, that was the way that it was. People saw them as creepy. They even looked at them as otherworldly, or witches, or practitioners of some kind of dark arts. People were frightened of her, but people nonetheless would come to her for services when they were sick. Doctors in this area, even on into the 60s, doctors was not as easily accessible as they are now. Now, after not being seen for a while, the property owner went down to check on the old root doctor. And he found her cabin door open, and her cabin was in disarray. And it was evident that there was some kind of struggle, and the old lady was missing. The property owner contacted the sheriff, and they put a posse together, and they did a thorough search of the property and the area in general, and they found nothing. She had just disappeared, and that foul play was suspected. Now, there was one suspect that the sheriff had, but also the community in general. Now, small communities are going to make assumptions, and they're going to generate rumors and things like that. But there was a man who had taken his wife for treatment to this root doctor, and the wife was in advanced stages of some kind of disease that ultimately killed her. And this man blamed the root doctor. And so naturally, people thought that he may have done that simply because he was bitter and mad over what had happened. So finding out this story and this history of the property made sense to Connie's mother and to her father. And things continued to happen on and off, different things, noises in the house, disembodied voices. Some things were tried. My witness, Miss Connie, was young then. She don't know exactly what was tried. But then in springtime, a few years after this conversation I just described to you occurred, Connie's younger sister went to the chicken coop to get eggs. As she turned around from the chicken coop to go back to the house, she was completely horrified to find this old, scary woman standing right in front of her. And the old hag put her finger up to her mouth as if to say, shh. And Connie's little sister dropped the eggs and ran around the entity into the house screaming. And then her father got home later and she gave the account of what happened to her father. She was still hysterical and you can't hardly blame her. They had a new pastor at the church that they attended. And this pastor said he was simply at a loss. He didn't know how to handle the situation, but that he knew somebody who would know how. A pastor who was a pastor and then turned evangelist, who lived in the area of Charlotte, North Carolina, was contacted. A man that their pastor personally knew, and this preacher man, who was somewhat of a spiritual special forces guy, if I can put it that way, he agreed to meet with the family in a few weeks. Meanwhile, it was late fall. It was time to turn the garden with the plow. You want to turn your garden before winter hits and the freeze-thaw cycle will break the dirt down. So Connie's father had also cleared off a wooded area that had previously been unused. Now he's plowed the new area, and he rolled over a spot, and the front tires of the tractor sunk into the ground. He figured out real quick he wasn't going to get the tractor out himself, so he went next door and he got a neighbor, and the neighbor came with his tractor and pulled his tractor out. The neighbor told him in a conversation immediately afterward, he said, "I believe you have hit the old vertical mine shaft that was covered many years ago." And he said, "I heard it was here for many years, and since I've been here," and the guy had grew up there, he said, it's never been uncovered, but it was a gold mine or it was a mica mine or it was an iron mine. Nobody knew. They just knew it used to be there. And it made sense that it could have been an iron mine because one of the previous owner from back in the old days had a smelter and a small forge. So the neighbor left. Her father got on the tractor. He looked down to put the tractor in gear. And he looked up, and for the first time, he got to see this horrifying, ghostly woman. She stood there just looking at him. She was grimacing. She was even showing her teeth, and she was pointing her bony finger at him. She began moving her mouth, but the tractor running kept him from hearing what was being said. And he put the tractor in gear, and he drove all the way up to the back door of the house. It didn't stop at the barn to park the tractor or anything. The out-of-town preacher came a few weeks later and sat down and listened intently to the family's experiences and what they had learned about the history of the property. And he seemed to take special note of the old filled-in mine shaft. They contacted the sheriff about the situation. He said, "We can't excavate that. It's too risky for a case that's more than 60 years old." So the preacher had an idea. Connie's mother and father agreed. At that spot where the old mine shaft was or was suspected to be, they, along with this evangelist, this preacher, held a funeral service. They couldn't afford a piece of carved granite, so they placed what the old timers call a tomb rock there. And her father carved a wooden headstone for her. And the family never had a problem again. So I hope that whoever lives there to this day is keeping that grave up. Guys, I appreciate you, and I will see you next time